The night was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't see your own hand in front of your face, and Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison gripped the wheel of PT-109 as his patrol torpedo boat cut through the Solomon Sea at 40 knots, hunting Japanese convoys that had been terrorizing Allied supply lines for weeks. He'd been doing this for 6 months now, leading night patrols through enemy waters, and he'd learned to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. Tonight felt wrong. The radio chatter had gone quiet an hour ago, and the usual sounds of distant gunfire had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made every man on his boat grip their weapons a little tighter. Morrison was 28 years old, a former merchant marine officer from Boston who joined the Navy after Pearl Harbor, and in that moment, staring into the darkness ahead, he had no idea he was about to experience the most insane 72 hours of his life. His radar operator suddenly shouted a warning, but it was already too late because a Japanese destroyer had appeared out of nowhere, less than 300 yards off the port side, and Morrison barely had time to yell for evasive action before the night exploded in fire and metal. The destroyer's 5-inch guns opened up, and the first shell hit PT-109 directly in the engine compartment, turning the entire stern section into a fireball that lit up the ocean for miles. Morrison felt himself flying through the air, his body tumbling end over end as the boat disintegrated beneath him, and then he hit the water hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. The ocean was burning with fuel oil, pieces of his boat were raining down around him, and he could hear men screaming in the darkness. He counted heads in the water and realized with a sinking feeling that only 4 of his 12-man crew had survived. They were 15 miles from the nearest friendly base, surrounded by Japanese-controlled waters, and their boat was at the bottom of the ocean. Quick thing before we continue. Hit subscribe if you want more incredible WW2 stories like this because we're building something special here, and you'll want to be part of it. What Morrison didn't know as he treaded water in that burning sea was that his night was about to get a whole lot stranger, because 3 miles away sat something that would change everything, and in less than 24 hours, he'd be using Japanese weapons to hunt Japanese ships in a way that would make Navy historians shake their heads in disbelief for decades to come. This is the story of how one American officer turned a complete disaster into one of the war's most audacious counterattacks. Morrison and his 4 surviving crew members spent 6 hours in the water before they spotted land, a small volcanic island that wasn't even on their charts, and they swam toward it through the darkness with Japanese patrol boats crisscrossing the area searching for survivors to capture or kill. By the time they dragged themselves onto the rocky beach, they were exhausted, freezing despite the tropical heat, and completely out of options. The island was maybe 2 miles across, covered in thick jungle, and Morrison knew that if Japanese troops were stationed there, his war was over. But they had no choice except to explore because staying on that exposed beach meant certain death. So as soon as the sun came up, Morrison and his radio man, a kid from Texas named Billy Crawford, started working their way through the jungle to see what they were dealing with. They moved carefully through the dense vegetation for about an hour, following a barely visible trail that showed signs of recent use, and then Crawford grabbed Morrison's arm and pointed through the trees towards something that made absolutely no sense. There, hidden in a small cove protected by overhanging rocks and camouflage netting, sat a Japanese Type C coastal submarine, about 80 feet long and sitting low in the water like a sleeping shark. Morrison's first thought was that they'd stumbled onto an enemy base and they were about to get captured, but as they watched from the jungle for 30 minutes, nothing moved and nobody appeared. The submarine looked abandoned, or maybe the crew was sleeping, but Morrison noticed something important when he looked closer through the binoculars he'd somehow managed to keep during the sinking. The sub's conning tower hatch was open, and he could see water damage along the hull that suggested it had run aground or been damaged and left behind. Morrison made a decision that most officers would have called insane, but he'd spent his entire adult life on boats, understanding how engines and mechanical systems worked, and he figured a submarine was just another boat with some extra complications. He told Crawford they were going to take that submarine, use it to sink some Japanese ships, and then somehow make it back to Allied lines. Crawford looked at him like he'd lost his mind, which was a fair assessment of the situation, But Morrison had already started thinking through the mechanics of how it might actually work. They spent the next 2 hours watching the cove, confirming there was no one aboard and no Japanese personnel on the island, before Morrison gathered his 4-man crew and told them the plan. 2 of them thought he was crazy, 1 thought it was brilliant, and Crawford just shrugged and said he'd follow Morrison into hell if that's what was needed, so they were going to steal a Japanese submarine. Getting aboard was the easy part because the boat was designed for a crew of 5, which was exactly what Morrison had, but once they climbed through that conning tower hatch and dropped into the control room, the real problems started hitting them like punches to the gut. Every instrument panel was labeled in Japanese characters that none of them could read. The control layout was completely different from American submarines Morrison had toured during training, and the air inside smelled like diesel fuel mixed with something rotten that suggested the previous crew had left in a hurry. Morrison stood there in the cramped control room, surrounded by valves and gauges and switches that controlled systems he could only guess at, and for about 30 seconds he wondered if he'd just led his men into a metal coffin they'd never figure out. But then his training kicked in, and he started applying basic principles of naval engineering to figure out what everything did. The ballast system was the first priority because without understanding how to dive and surface, they were sitting ducks, and Morrison spent 2 hours tracing pipes and valves until he figured out the basic pattern of how water was let into tanks to make the sub sink and blown out with compressed air to make it rise. The engine controls were actually simpler than he'd expected because diesel engines work pretty much the same way regardless of which country built them, and within an hour he had the auxiliary engine running, charging the batteries that would power the electric motors when they were underwater. The torpedo systems took the longest to figure out because the Type C carried 2 bow tubes loaded with Type 97 torpedoes, and Morrison had to practically disassemble the firing mechanism before he understood how the Japanese aiming system worked, which was actually less sophisticated than American systems, but still deadly if you could get close enough to your target. They spent an entire day and night practicing with the submarine while it was still hidden in the cove, learning how the controls responded, figuring out the sub's handling characteristics, and Morrison even took it out for a short surface run after dark to test the engines under load. The boat handled like a drunk pig compared to his nimble PT boat, slow to respond and wallowing in the waves, but it was functional and the torpedoes were armed and ready. Morrison calculated they had enough fuel for maybe 4 days of operation, and the 2 torpedoes meant they could engage 2 targets maximum before they were reduced to using the deck gun, which seemed like a terrible idea given that this submarine wasn't built for surface combat. But 2 torpedoes meant 2 chances to hurt the enemy, and Morrison had spent 6 months watching Japanese convoys kill American soldiers, so he was ready to take those chances. On their second night with the submarine, Morrison navigated out of the cove and headed toward the shipping lanes where Japanese convoys typically ran between the Solomon Islands and Rabaul, moving slowly on the surface to conserve battery power and using the night darkness for cover. The submarine's periscope was functional but scratched, making it hard to see clearly, and the navigation equipment was minimal, just a basic compass and charts that Morrison had to interpret using his knowledge of the area. Around midnight, they spotted lights on the horizon, and Morrison ordered them to dive for the first time with him at the controls, saying a silent prayer as he manipulated valves and felt the submarine start to sink beneath the waves. The descent was rough and they dropped faster than he'd intended, bottoming out at about 60 feet with a jarring thud that knocked equipment loose, but they were underwater and still alive, which counted as a victory. Through the periscope, Morrison could see a Japanese merchant ship, probably 8,000 tons, escorted by a single small destroyer that was running a lazy patrol pattern about a mile away. He maneuvered the submarine into attack position using the electric motors, which were quieter than he'd expected, and lined up his shot using the mechanical calculator that he'd figured out controlled the torpedo aiming system. At 400 yards, he gave the order to fire the first torpedo, and the submarine shuddered as compressed air ejected the weapon from the tube. Morrison counted the seconds, watching through the periscope as the torpedo's wake cut through the water, and then the merchant ship exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the entire ocean. The destroyer immediately turned toward them, dropping depth charges that were close enough to make the submarine's hull groan with stress, but Morrison had already taken them deep and was running silent, creeping away from the attack zone while the Japanese searched for a submarine they couldn't believe existed in these waters. Morrison sank 2 more ships over the next 48 hours, a transport loaded with troops and another merchant vessel, using tactics he invented on the spot and learning from each attack how to handle the submarine more effectively. The second ship he hit from only 200 yards away after stalking it for 3 hours, and the explosion was so close that shrapnel from the sinking vessel actually hit the submarine's conning tower. By the time he'd fired both torpedoes and had no ammunition left, Morrison knew they had to make a run for Allied territory before their luck ran out, so he turned the submarine south and started the dangerous journey back to friendly waters, navigating by dead reckoning and hoping they didn't run into any Allied ships that would sink them before they could identify themselves. The trip back took 36 hours of constant tension because every ship they spotted could be friend or enemy, and the submarine's radio had been damaged before they found it, leaving them with no way to communicate their identity. Morrison kept the submarine on the surface as much as possible, flying an improvised American flag made from cloth they'd found aboard, and when they finally spotted an American destroyer on patrol near Guadalcanal, he came to full stop and had his entire crew stand on deck with their hands raised so there'd be no confusion about who they were. The destroyer's captain initially thought it was a trick and nearly opened fire before he got close enough to see that the men on the submarine's deck were wearing American uniforms and yelling in English that they were friendly. Morrison delivered the captured Japanese submarine to naval intelligence officers who couldn't quite believe what they were hearing, and the technical information gained from examining the intact boat proved valuable for understanding Japanese submarine capabilities and tactics. The 3 ships Morrison had sunk with that submarine represented over 20,000 tons of Japanese merchant capacity destroyed, along with hundreds of troops and supplies that never reached their destination. He received the Navy Cross for his actions, though the full story was classified for years because the Navy didn't want the Japanese to know how much intelligence had been gained from the captured submarine. Jack Morrison survived the war and returned to Boston, where he ran a small shipyard and rarely talked about his time in the Pacific because he said most people wouldn't believe him anyway. The captured Japanese submarine was eventually scuttled after Navy engineers had learned everything they could from it, but Morrison kept a piece of the conning tower hatch as a reminder of the 3 days when he turned the worst night of his life into something the Japanese never saw coming. By the end of 1944, American forces had captured or destroyed over 200 Japanese submarines throughout the Pacific, but Morrison's remains the only documented case of an American crew operating a captured enemy submarine in combat and successfully using it to sink enemy vessels. Sometimes the best revenge is using their own weapons against them. Thanks for watching this incredible story from WW2 Vault. Next week we're covering the moment a single American tank crew held off an entire German battalion for 3 days straight. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.